Hello, I'm Elgon Williams. I'm an author with Panda Moon Publishing. My first book with Panda Moon is Fried Windows. I've decided to go into a video format to answer some questions that I regularly get. The top question I get is, when did I decide to become a writer? I was probably around 13 years old, 13-ish. I was always interested in fantasy, coming up with my own stories. Kind of born a creative person, I guess. I think it comes from having two older sisters, one 4 years older and one 9 years older. And I had to pretty much grow up relying on myself for entertainment. So it produced a fertile imagination. And I grew up on a farm, had woods behind my house when I was really young. And I used to go into the woods and explore and have a lot of fun adventures up there, creating a lot of things. TV was fairly new back then, and watched TV in the evening and acted out my own little fantasies during the day. Tended to be kind of a loner because there weren't a lot of kids around to play with that were my age. There was a black family that lived on the other side of the hill, through the woods, and I was good friends with them. So I did play with them. Usually I was out in my own devices. If I went to the farm with my dad, sometimes we would take a break and we'd end up at a farm implements company. It was kind of a meeting place for all the local farmers and their kids. So those were the kids that I associated with, and primarily the owner's son of the farm implements company. His name was Johnny. He sort of became my de facto best friend. For several years, we grew up together, and we had kind of a falling out. We went to different schools. I went to Pitchin Elementary. He went to South Charleston Elementary. First time that we kind of were together in school, they tried to integrate the school system a little bit, and we got into a bit of trouble together. When I was in high school, I had an English teacher. His name was Mrs. Ibbott. I had a lot of run-ins with her. Primarily, she told me I was mispronouncing my name. She also wrote on the margins of one of my assignments that I would never be a writer, so I kind of took that as a personal challenge. The first book-length story I wrote, I was in college. I worked on it for several years. I don't think you're born a writer. I think you are born with the inclination to be a writer, or kind of the different elements in your character that would permit you to be a writer. Interest in writing stories, interest in doing creative things, creating fantasies, imaginary characters, imaginary friends, that sort of thing. I had all those prerequisites, but I was trying to write the great American novel when I was in college, and I came up with a book-length story that I was rather proud of. I showed it to a friend, and she read it. She gave it back to me and told me that it was a good first draft. Kind of took offense to that because I thought it was a lot closer to being finished. In fact, I was thinking about sending it away to publishers, but obviously it wasn't up to that quality level, and I talked to several other people about it, and they said, well, go back and read it and revise it. When I went back to read it, I was devastated by how terrible it was. And I still keep it around to remind me of where I came from, and it's kind of a humbling thing to open it up every once in a while and read the drivel that I used to write. It was terrible. Technically, my first official publication was when I was in the Air Force. I wrote a unit history and received an outstanding award for it. The audience for that was probably about 3 or 4 people, so it exists somewhere, because they keep all the unit histories in an archive somewhere because of the classification of it. A very limited audience. What was the inspiration for Fried Windows? Well, Fried Windows is a magical realism type fantasy, an urban fantasy, and it evolved from a poem that I wrote when I was a member of an online community called Fan Story. I got talked into writing a poem. I don't consider myself a poet, and I wrote a poem. It got a fairly good response. It was about being a kid and going to a carnival and reconnection with childhood. That got me along the lines of thinking about writing a story about that. So that's where Fried Windows came in. I wrote a short story that became a short story and a sequel short story. and eventually evolved into 16 related short stories. And at the end of that process, I still considered it a series of short stories. Attempted to connect with magazines in the interest of getting some of them published, and was thinking it would be a nice serial type publication. After several rejections for it, I had gone through and edited on my own several of the stories, and I used an editor on the first two. And in that process, I figured out that there probably was the kernel of a novel there. So I cobbled it together with story connective material and wrote something of a conclusion to it, and I submitted it to Panda Moon Publishing. They were going to sign me to a contract for it. So it's kind of a funny thing that I kind of backed into writing it as a novel. At the time that I wrote Fried Windows, I was in a pretty dark place. I decided to make a go of it as a writer after years and years of working in retail. I had just left my previous job. I didn't have a lot of money. I was contending with alcoholism and other dark things that were going on in my life. I wasn't in a real good place. So Fried Windows kind of became an escape into a fantasy world for me as a writer. And I was investing a lot of myself into creating the book. It became kind of a therapeutic thing for me. I get asked a lot how much of the Brent Woods character in Fried Windows is me. There's a good bit of it. Brent Woods is an alter ego. My full name on my birth certificate is Elgon B. Williams. My mother decided not to give me a middle name, so I went by Elgon for most of my life. Throughout college, part of my military career, I went by Brent as my name. So a lot of people from those days remember me as Brent. A few of it, my real first name is Elgon. When I was in Asia, as part of my service with the Air Force, the locals had trouble pronouncing my name Brent. It usually came out as Blenta. Discovered that they could actually pronounce Elgon, which is ironic because my name has been mispronounced, butchered for my entire life. It's also the name of an extinct volcano in Kenya. So in college, Brent allowed me to be someone that I'd never been before, to create a kind of a fictitious identity for myself. That's the root origin of Brent Woods. And in the stories, Brent does a lot of things that I would never have the nerve to do. He's a little more sharp-tongued and more cynical, a little more sarcastic. He did a lot of things that I was never brave enough to do. So other than that, there is a good bit of my own life in the background details for Fried Windows. Brent is married to an Asian, like I was. He has 3 children. The children are patterned after my kids without actually being my kids. Some of the backstories that are mentioned in the novel are accurate, at least to my recollection. My kids might differ with some of the details. The portrayal of Brent's wife is fictitious. What's next in the series? If you've read the book and you read the ending, there is an opportunity left for carrying the story on. The next installment of the story begins in New Orleans, but it's an alternate universe version of New Orleans. It's a version of New Orleans that straddles the divide between our world and the fantasy world that Brent visits in Fried Windows. And Brent has to correct a lot of things that he did wrong in his life, and in the course of the book, he ends up in the fantasy world and he has to resolve some issues there. The alternate universe New Orleans is run by a drag queen. I realize that alternate universe New Orleans is kind of redundant. What's beyond that? There may be a third book in the series. I've got an idea for one. It's kind of in 3 or 4 different parts. There's a lot of backstory material that I have for Brent Woods about his childhood and about first year in college, about his senior year in high school. So there's a lot of material that I've actually written into a story form that may end up being published at some point. Brent also appears in the fantasy series with Wolfcat Chronicles, which is presently under contract with Panda Moon. The first book in the series is currently in editing, but hoping maybe later this year that will be published. If you have any other comments or questions, you can put them in the comments after this video is posted to YouTube.